The alarm clock shrieked at 4:47, as it always did for the last 11 years. Bud Sullivan silenced it with a slap of his hand against the cover of an old black alarm clock and swung his legs over the edge of his bed. The floorboards of the small and cramped living/working area were made of cold wood, and the ceiling had a few holes in it from the rain. The only reason Bud hadn't complained was because he had a warm pair of steel-toed boots to kick the cold floorboards with, and he wore a pair of old, worn blue overalls that had seen plenty of days like today. By 5:30, he was at the Quarry, the old limestone pit which had belonged to his family for 3 generations. His father had worked there, and so had his granddad, and now he was the last one left. The land the quarry occupied had been sold to some billionaire developer. Everyone knew that the quarry was going to be closed down. Bud looked over the block of limestone he had been working on for the last 2 weeks. It was a very beautiful piece of stone that had seen a lot of his time and effort go into it. He knew it well. His father had taught him everything he knew about quarries and cutting up stone, and he had learned it well. Every building in the city had a piece of this quarry in it, from the courthouse to the old library and the bank on 5th Street. Around 9, a black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the quarry. The 2 security guards got out first, and then the platinum blonde woman in a bright red designer pantsuit got out. Bud had seen her around the city before. She was always in a different color, but she always wore pantsuits. Victoria Sterling was her name, and she was 55 years old. Her diamond earrings were the size of chandeliers, and her designer shoes made a rhythmic click-clack sound as she walked up to the security guards. She looked around at the quarry. "This is it?" Victoria asked disdainfully, her voice carrying over the entire quarry. "This is it?" she asked again, her voice directed at her assistant this time. "Do you see this? This is where my new set of estates is going to be built." Bud kept working on the piece of limestone he had been working on, trying to ignore the woman in the bright red pantsuit. He didn't know why he was paying any attention to her, but he felt her eyes bore into him as if trying to make him stop working. "What is your name?" she asked suddenly, making Bud stop working and look up at her. Bud stood and looked at her, wiping his hands on his overalls. "My name is Sullivan, but most people call me Bud." Victoria Sterling took a good long look at Bud down her binocular-style sunglasses before speaking again. "Bud," she said, the disgust practically dripping from her every syllable. "How fitting that a man with a name as simple as his work is going to lose his quarry to me." She reached out and grabbed him by his worn overalls collar with her manicured fingers. Bud looked surprised at first before she started to rip his overalls open with her bare hands. Her face twisted in rage as she looked down at him. "You think this quarry is important?" she hissed, her face only inches from his. "You think it is special in any way? I am going to build my palace on top of it, you pathetic nobody." Bud stood and looked at her, his torn overalls hanging from his shoulders, exposing his chest to the cold morning air. The other men had stopped working, and the guards looked quite uncomfortable. No one spoke up, not even the guards. She let go of his overalls and stepped back, shaking her hands as if she had touched something filthy. "Get this man off my property," Victoria said to the guards before looking back at Bud. "And don't let me see his face again." Bud looked at the woman for a long moment before turning and walking back toward the pit. He had a strange feeling growing inside his chest. It wasn't a warm feeling, but it was filling his body with energy nonetheless. The morning sun was rising higher now, but Bud barely felt the warmth of it. His overalls were torn, hanging loosely from his shoulders and showing the muscle of his defined chest, which was dusted with the fine powder from the quarry. The rest of the workers had formed a semicircle around Bud and Victoria. There were at least 30 of them, some operating large machines, others cutting up and stacking the stone. They all looked on as Victoria stood in the middle of the semicircle. Her bright red pantsuit shined in the morning, and gold bracelets clinked as she adjusted her sunglasses. A giant sign stating Sterling Properties Private Property, No Trespassing in bold red letters loomed over her head, mounted on the large iron gates that surrounded the pit. Behind and to the left of the giant sign, the old sign from the quarry company hung, its faded yellow paint peeling. Safety first, hard hats required, the old sign stated. "You are still standing here?" Victoria asked, her heels clicking as she walked towards Bud. "I told these men to get rid of you." "I am not going to leave," Bud said simply, his eyes locked on hers the whole time. One of the guards stepped forward. "Ma'am, we were just about to escort him off the property." Victoria snapped her fingers, and the guard fell silent. "I will deal with this worm myself." She stalked up to Bud and grabbed him by the overalls again, her manicured fingernails digging into the torn fabric. Her face was close to his again, and Bud could smell her expensive perfume wafting over him, making his stomach churn. "You think you have dignity?" She spat at him, her eyes wild. "You think standing there with your chest out makes you a man?" Victoria took both of his overalls by the torn front part and ripped it completely off of him, sending the discarded fabric to the ground at his feet with a loud, ripping noise. "Look at him!" Victoria shouted at the workers, gesturing furiously at Bud with her other hand. "This nobody chipped rocks while I built my way to the top. Your hands were made for hard labor, while my hands build legacies." Victoria grabbed a block of limestone off of a nearby pile and held it up to her chest, her rings clinking against the rough stone. "This is what he thinks is important," she said, staring furiously at Bud before throwing the block of stone far back into the pit from where Bud had stood moments before. The sound of it hitting the deep pit far below resounded loudly in the morning air. Victoria grabbed Bud's tool belt and tore it off of his hips before handing it to the guards. "Get him tools out of my sight," she snapped, her voice dripping with loathing. The guards took Bud's father's tools and dropped them one by one into the deep pit, the sound of them hitting the ground echoing loudly. Bud stood frozen in place. His hands shook at his sides, and his heart thundered in his ears, beating too fast. He looked down at the torn overalls on the ground, and his heart clenched painfully in his chest. The guards and the other workers looked at Bud strangely, some looking away, others with their mouths open in shock. A younger foreman named Derek took a step forward, but Bud shot him a murderous glare, and he stopped in his tracks. Victoria turned back to Bud and smiled at him. "You have nothing now, do you?" she said in a sing-song voice. "No tools, no shirt, no pride. Just like your quarry, you will cease to exist by the end of this month." As she walked up to him and whispered the next words in his ear so that only he could hear, "You are pathetic, and everyone in this city is going to know it." Victoria turned on her heel and walked back toward the waiting Rolls-Royce, the guards following closely behind. The other workers parted when she approached, like the Red Sea. Bud stood in the center of the workers, forming the semicircle, his chest exposed to the morning chill. His stomach was knotted, and his heart beat too fast, but the fire had gone out of him. He walked past the workers and the guards and got in the back of the Rolls-Royce. His father's tools still went clink, As they dropped one by one into the deep quarry pit, their sounds floating up and around him. It was like the sound of his heart, steady and rhythmic, though his heart still beat far too fast. Victoria turned around and looked at Bud in the rearview mirror. "You should have told me who you were," she said to him as the car pulled away. "I would have taken better care of you." The Rolls-Royce doors opened, and Bud stepped out in front of his small, run-down shack. His father's overalls were still in his hands, and his heart was still beating way too fast. He looked around the yard, taking in the sight of the two signs. One big and bold in bright red, the other smaller but just as important in faded yellow. He looked back at his small shack and then at the ground. Bud slowly bent down and picked up a strip of his father's overalls and tucked it into his back pocket. He then looked back at the pit. Bud walked back to his shack that morning, his chest exposed to the cold morning air, and his father's overalls torn and hanging loosely from his shoulders. He knew the truth, and he knew that someday it would come out, and when it did, he would be there to see it happen. The first thing Bud saw when he pushed through the door to his shack was the cold, empty room. He looked in the mirror in the small bathroom and took in the sight of him. His chest was all dust, and his skin was marked with the red impressions of Victoria's fingernails. His mouth was a tight line, but his eyes held a strange determination that hadn't been there the previous day. Bud pushed himself away from the mirror and made his way to the small room at the end of the hallway. He opened the door and took in the sight of the small collection of objects that were his father's belongings. There were old family photos, a frayed-looking union card, and a small leather-bound book filled with his father's writing. Bud picked up the book and opened it to a random page, reading over the neatly written words. His father had written about every single piece of stone he had ever worked on, and then he had written something that caught Bud's eye. It was 35 years old, and his father's handwriting was a shaky mess. "The foundation on which the Sterling Bank is built is made up of stolen land. I carved the truth into the stone, hiding it for safety. One day, someone will come to claim it." Bud's heart skipped a beat as he read his father's words again. Someone had indeed come to claim it. The man who had built the Sterling Bank had been Victoria's father, and the truth was hiding in the stone. It had been hiding for 35 years, but it would no longer be hidden. Bud put the book back in its place and picked up another one, this one filled with notes and calculations. The Sterling Bank building had undergone a few renovations, but its foundations were still intact. The original block of limestone was still there, as was another one of the same size and texture. If the carving on the foundation stone was there, it would hold the key to everything. Bud would need proof that his father had carved it, and he would need to be able to access it somehow. He stayed up all night, and he made plans. He woke up the next morning and contacted an old contact of his, a lawyer who handled a lot of tribal land cases. He informed the tribal council of what he had found, and he helped him make arrangements. He had no money, no tools, and no shirt, but he had time, and time was all he needed. 3 days later, Bud stood outside the Sterling Bank, a new shirt in his hands. The simple but clean white shirt didn't seem to fit him at all as he looked over the bank. He had visited it a few times in his younger years, cutting up the stone for one of its renovations. He stepped inside the bank and looked around, taking in the sight of the familiar but slightly modified interior. He had memorized the layout of the place, so he knew exactly where to go. The basement, where the foundation stones were held. Bud looked around the room before spotting the giant block of limestone behind some filing cabinets. He walked over to it and ran his hand over the rough surface of the stone, feeling the familiar indentations. Bud looked closely, and there, carved into the stone, were the words, "This foundation rests on stolen ground. The land belongs to the Osage people." Bud's heart was pounding wildly in his chest, and he felt dizzy. His father's words were etched into the side of the bank, telling the whole world the truth. Bud took a few photos to document the carving and took some close-ups with his phone. He then walked out of the basement, the proof safely tucked in his shirt pocket. 3 weeks went by, and Bud had visited the Sterling Bank 5 more times in the meantime. He had taken more photos and made rubbings of the carving so that it would be admissible in court. Victoria Sterling's construction crews were finally stopped dead in their tracks when the federal marshals arrived at the quarry. The tribal council had filed a lawsuit against her, accusing her of trespassing on Osage land. The council had hired a lawyer with a vast knowledge of tribal law, and Bud had given him all the evidence he had found. Victoria's lawyers fought them tooth and nail, but the truth was right there, carved into the side of the Sterling Bank. The federal judge ruled in the council's favor, stopping all construction of the billion-dollar mansion. Bud stood at the edge of the quarry that evening, looking out over the pit. His father's torn overalls were in his back pocket, and he wore a new shirt that morning. The council would be taking the land in a few days, and the woman who had tried to ruin him was going to be ruined herself. The courtroom was packed, and the room was silent as Bud stood up. He looked down at the large photo in his hands, the one of the carved foundation stone. The words, "This foundation rests on stolen ground," were burned into his retinas. He could practically hear his father's voice as he spoke. "The land belongs to the Osage people." Victoria Sterling's lawyer objected furiously as he stood up. "This is absurd. That man is a nobody. He carved that himself to ruin my client." Judge Harrington brought his gavel down with a resounding smack. "Sit down, Ms. Sterling," he said icily. Victoria got up and stormed toward Bud, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Her bodyguards tried to stop her, but she brushed them off. She reached Bud and grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, digging her nails into the fabric. "You think you've won?" Victoria hissed at him, spittle flying from her mouth. "You think you've won just because you found some carving in my bank." She ripped his shirt and tried to take it off him again, but Bud caught her wrists with both hands. The whole courtroom was watching the exchange, and reporters were snapping photos left and right. Victoria had a wild look in her eyes, but Bud's face was unreadable. His voice was quiet as he spoke, only Victoria hearing him. "I'm not the same man I was when you tore my overalls, Victoria. This time I have the truth, and the truth is carved in stone." The bailiff came forward and pulled Victoria away from Bud. Her expensive blouse was rumpled, and her carefully done hair was coming out, but none of that mattered to Bud. The tribal council presented their case, and soon enough, the judge ruled in their favor. Victoria's land, the bank, and the unfinished mansion were placed under federal custody, and her financial assets were frozen. Bud watched from the back of the courtroom as the council members filed out and congratulated themselves. Victoria's press conference was right around the corner, but Bud had bigger plans. He walked out the courtroom doors and looked out over the city before finding his target. Victoria stood a few feet away from him, her heels clicking against the pavement. Her legal team was filing out of the room one by one, leaving her to fend for herself. "Bud," she said when she saw him. "Bud, wait." He stopped and turned around to look at her. "What do you want, Victoria?" "I want you to leave me alone." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. Bud looked back at her, his arms crossed over his chest. "You stood in my quarry, tore my overalls off, dumped my father's tools in the pit and called me your rubble. Bud said to her, but rubble is just stone waiting to be shaped, and you are just a woman who has built her fortune on stolen land and shattered pride. I hope it was worth it. I hope it was all worth it when you find out what happens next. Bud walked away from her, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the pavement. The sun was setting behind the city skyline, casting an orange glow over the buildings. That night Bud stood at the edge of the quarry, looking over the pit. His father's overalls were in his back pocket, and he held the torn strip of fabric high as he looked at the pit. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered to himself. "You shaped the truth, and I just helped the world see it."